Hello, World of Tank Blitzers and future Mumrads. I'm Littlefinger, here to share a little bit more knowledge with you today, this time reviewing the British tank lines. I think in all corny fashion here, I'll call this review a tale of two tanks. Why? Well, that's because of all the nationalities in Blitz. I find this one the hardest to put generalities on. Take, for example, the medium line that starts in the lower tiers on the light side with high mobility and good DPM. But in the middle tiers, you start getting into the Cromwell Comet, get bigger, slightly bigger tanks, and they still have good mobility. Their guns are on the weaker side. And then when you get to the upper tiers in the Centurions, these are large tanks for mediums. And they have weak armor and poor mobility until you fully upgrade them. Their guns are initially pretty bad, but the top tier guns are actually pretty good. So you take that one line and it varies quite significantly. So my generality on British tanks is that they have highly accurate guns with a fast rate of fire. They do less damage on a per shot basis, but still have a fairly high DPM. The armor is average to below average except for the TDs where it's above average. The mobility is average to above average except for the TD line, which is below average. So you get a little bit of everything as you go down the line for the British tanks. Let's start out with the British mediums. These actually start out as light tanks with the Cruiser Mark III and Mark IV. And these tanks have high mobility and a high rate of fire. Very low alpha, but because of their high rate of fire, do a very high damage per minute. These tanks have terrible armor, but good penetrating guns. And the grind up through these is fairly easy, I thought. I struggled a little bit once I got into the Tier 4 and Tier 5. That's the Covenanter and the Crusader, and I struggle primarily just because the armor was so weak against some of the stronger guns at this tank, and the alpha damage on these tanks is just so low. But then once you get up to Tier 6 and Tier 7 with the Cromwell and Comet, you're finding much better. These tanks have better armor, and they're starting to do more damage on their shots, and you can control a battle with these tanks. And then once you get to Tier 8 with the introduction of the Centurion, this tank gets much bigger and is bigger than just average medium tanks in other countries. And your mobility suffers, and it took me a little while to learn to play these, but once I did, I did get better with them. You really have to change your play style significantly along this tank line. So with the upper tier mediums, use their strong turrets and play it more like a heavy tank. And also, a word to the wise, save up your free experience points on these ones because there's a huge difference between their stock gun and their upgraded gun. So the Tier 10 FV 4202, let's take a look at it. Here is the FV 4202. I would say this is more of a hybrid medium heavy. It doesn't have the speed there at 40 kilometers per hour that the other mediums do, and it really doesn't have the armor, 121 millimeters hull armor, that the other heavies do. So it's kind of in between, but what it does have is a really good gun, and it also shoots high explosive squash head HESH. You see there the penetration values. The AP is really good at 268, doing 350 alpha damage. The HESH actually has a lower penetration value at 210, but does 440. With a rate of fire at 7.9, this does over 2,700 DPM. So a lot of people really rave about the gun, but complain about stats like its maneuverability and armor. So this is a good hill fighter. If that's the style you like, this is the tank for you. Let's take a look at the heavy line, which ends with the FV215B. Again, this is another tale of two tanks as you progress up this tank line. So starting out with the Vickers medium, these tanks are much larger than their peers and they have little armor, but they do have very good guns for being in a tier 2 and tier 3. So map awareness is really crucial for this. You have to be careful of faster tanks that might flank you or get to your side. So just be aware of that as you start playing these tanks. And then once you get up to the tier 4, you get into the Churchill. The Matilda. And the Matilda has extreme armor. It does lack mobility, and it does have a weak gun. But your armor is your best asset as far as this tank. So you've gone from small no armor to big tons of armor, and then at tier 5 you go to the Churchill 1, which I felt was a fun tank to drive. It's got good armor and fairly good mobility for the size, and a really good gun on it. And then you come to the Churchill 7 and the Black Prince, which by far have been my least favorite tanks in World of Tank Blitz. I've had fairly good stats as far as damage, but I just didn't win at my normal win rate with these tanks. And so the grind is pretty hard for me anyway from the Churchill 7 and Black Prince. And then you get to the tier 8 Carnarvon. I have purchased this tank, but I haven't played it yet, just because of the fact that the Top Gun makes or breaks this tank, and I don't want to spend the free experience points on it yet. But that's a 20-pound gun with super high damage. At tier 9, you get to the Conqueror, and you lose the armor for more mobility, and again, a really nice gun once you've upgraded it. So that takes us to the FV215B. So here we have the FV215B. It shares the same hull as the Conqueror, but with a little bit more armor. They did increase that. The turret gets more armor and is moved to the back, which from what I hear makes playing this a little bit more challenging, as you're having to get that turret over the tank, the full length of the tank. But the benefit of this tank is its great firepower and DPM compared to other heavies. You can see there 6.9 rounds per minute with a DPM of 2600, whereas if we remember the German heavies were in the low 2000s. But you do sacrifice armor compared to those German tanks. So I would say hopefully by now, if you've been driving the Centurions, you've mastered the art of being hull down and hill fighting, because your lower glacis and side armor on this tank are your major weak spots. At 34 kilometers per hour, the speed is just average for the tier, but you look at the AP and APCR penetration values there at 259 and 326 are really good. So I think this is going to be a fun tank, and I am looking forward to playing it. So now let's take a look at the British TD line that finishes with the FV215B 183. In general, the tank destroyer lines are well protected but slow moving beasts with decent firepower. But again, there is some variation across this line. The Tier 2 Universal Carrier 2 PDR is small and frail. It has decent mobility and a quick reloading gun. However, you must stay kind of more on the back lines with this tank because it does lack any form of armor. Then at tier 3, you get into the Valentine AT, which has great hull armor, but a huge weak spot on the front around the gun. It does have a howitzer gun, which is kind of fun, as you can one-shot many of the tanks in the tier. But again, the frontal armor on that tank is your biggest weak spot. And then when you get to tier 4, you get to the super fast Electo, which has extremely weak armor. So really on this tank, you've got to use its mobility. It does have a very quick firing gun, and you've got to move around the map. You can't camp in any one spot, and that's how you play that tank. At tier 5 is where you get into the AT series. The AT2 is an extremely slow tank, but has really good armor for its tier. I think this is best played on the front lines. Use it to draw enemy fire and bounce shots and let your team support you from behind. Only problem here is that the tank is super slow, and unless you're getting pushed, you'll often find yourself left behind in the battle, which is kind of frustrating because then you end up being like 5-on-1, and that doesn't end well in this tank. And then, of course, you get into the AT-8 and AT-15, where the armor is good, but the other tanks in the tier, their guns can do a little bit more damage, and the players are better. They know your weak spot, so it's a little bit harder to play this as a frontline tank. So I would say more as a second line tank. And stay with the team as long as you can, because this will keep you from getting flanked. The FV215B183 is extremely fragile. It's fairly slow for its class, and because it has such a great gun, you're going to be the focus for the enemy team as they want to get your gun out of the game as soon as possible. But the 183mm L4 gun is why you struggled through all of those damn games in the AT series tanks. If we look at the damage on this tank, the AP round does 1150 damage, and the HE does 1750. It only has a rate of fire of 2 rounds per minute, which gives you a DPM of 2300. But I think the joy in playing this game is similar to the SU Russian line and KV2 with their big dirt guns, and just dropping 1700 hit points on somebody pretty much ruins their game, put them on life support in just one shot. So I think this is probably a little bit more challenging to play just because of the turret being so far back and having only 5 degrees of gun depression, but probably well worth it when you drop a HE round into somebody. So anyway, looking forward to this tank as well, but the grind is challenging. Sorry guys, but I skipped over the tortoise, but I think you get the picture, as this is just a continuation of the AT line. So anyway guys, hope you enjoyed this review. Stay safe out there. Get educated, not fingered. Littlefinger out.